Hi, everybody. Welcome back. This is Professor H. We are going to talk tonight about Chapter 5, Part 2, Cognitive Development in Toddlerhood. Go ahead and start our screen share, as is the way we do things. And here we go. Okay, Chapter 5, Part 2, Cognitive Development in Toddlerhood. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at a couple of different theories of cognitive development and language development. We're going to start off with Piaget's theory. We've talked a little bit about this theory in a previous lecture. We are looking at the sensory motor stage, which is basically from 0 to 2 years old. And of course, when we talked about this stage in infancy. This stage continues on into toddlerhood, as it doesn't end until 2 years old, according to this theory. At this stage, and remember, the sensory motor period is where our infant and our toddler are experiencing the world greatly through their senses, through their vision, their hearing, their sight, their touch, putting things in their mouth, just experimenting with stuff. They, at this stage in toddlerhood, have learned to form mental representations. They have become little scientists. They are able to think, by the time they're 2 years old, at the end part of this stage, they are able to think about the possibilities and outcomes of the actions that they take. For example, if I stuff this toy, if I put this toy in the toilet and then flush it, what will happen? I'm going to see what happens. So they'll get to do some experimentation like that at this stage. Also, use of words is a type of mental representation because our words are representing something real. In this stage, it is also a time, according to Piaget, when children start doing something called deferred imitation. Deferred imitation is when a child observes an action and then repeats this action at a later time. For example, you're sitting in line at Walmart, the child in front of you throws itself on the floor, pitches a complete fit, and mom picks it up, maybe gives it candy, does something, and your child is sitting there calmly watching the situation, taking it all in. You're at home the next day, you tell the child no, they can't have something, and all of a sudden they throw this complete fit just like the one that they saw happen at Walmart. And they hadn't done it before. This would be an example of deferred imitation. They thought about this strategy that they saw put in place, and then they tried it out on their own. It is also something that is used in play. For example, say we have a mom with a new baby and they're feeding the baby and caring for the baby, and maybe our child observes this behavior and feeds their own doll and changes their own doll's diaper. Or maybe they saw dad smoke a cigarette, so they got their crayon and they're in their room playing, and then they're smoking their crayon, because this is deferred imitation. They saw this happen and then they tried it on their own. Piaget used to think that, according to Piaget's theory, he suspected that this started at 18 months of age. However, more recent research indicates that this behavior, this deferred imitation, can occur as early as 6 weeks. This was measured using an experiment that looked at facial expressions. Somebody had basically made expressions to an infant. A stranger made a weird face at an infant, and then that infant the following day repeated that weird face at a later time. So that was taken as evidence that this deferred imitation could occur earlier. Part of the, kind of a physical reason why this may be occurring is development of the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a brain structure that is extremely important in long-term memory and recalling. So it is a structure important for memory, and we know that as our toddler grows, their hippocampus is becoming more well developed. And as this develops, as this structure develops more fully, they will have better ability to retain information, and by having better ability to retain and memorize information or remember information, they can recall that information later and utilize it, for example, with deferred imitation. Another thing that our 2-year-olds learn to do is something called categorization. Wow, putting things in categories. I can't even say the word. According to Piaget, this is when, for example, if I give you, the child some dinosaurs and some horses and some circles or balls, they would, categorizing would be to put all the dinosaurs in one spot, all the horses in one spot, all the balls in one spot, just grouping them like that. A study by Bornstein and Atterbury in 2010 said that, and I'm sorry I don't have the reference at the end of this video, you can look at your book and get the actual true reference for this. This is the name of the study, but I don't have the link to it in the PowerPoint, and I apologize for that. So at 9, 12, and 18 months, these children were given 4 horses and 4 pencils. The 9-month-old played with the items, messed with them, that particular group of kids just played with the items. They did not separate them, group them, categorize them. The 12-month-old, however, would categorize them. They separated them. Horses went here and pencils went here, and they kept them separated from each other. By 24 years of age, or 24 months of age, it was found that children would possibly sort things by their function. For example, if I gave a kid a bunch of, if I gave them some dinosaurs that were toys and some dinosaur erasers and some dinosaur, and maybe some horse erasers and horse toys, they might put a pile of horses, a pile of dinosaurs, they might put all of the erasers in a pile. So they might be categorizing by function, not just by being a horse. A horse racer would be separate from the horse toy. So they're able to categorize by function. Another theory about cognitive development was put forth by Lev Vygotsky, and he viewed development as both a social and a cultural process. So his theory is a socio-cultural theory, whereas Piaget's is a cognitive theory, just looking at the thinking and cognitive processes of the child, but not considering culture. Whereas Vygotsky considered the culture as being very important and the social processes as being very important for the development of the child. The social portion is because children learn through interaction with others, and the people within their culture and in their immediate world are going to be where they get their source of learning. Cultural, because what children need to know is determined by the culture they live in. For example, in one society, it may be very important for a child to learn the basics of sheep herding and being able to watch out for predators and move the sheep from place to place and do these types of things. These may be educational things that are important for that child in that society, whereas a Western child needs to go to school, but they don't necessarily need to know about sheep herding. So what they learn has a lot to do, and what's important for them to learn has a lot to do with the culture in which they are raised. The way children learn, according to this particular theory, is through the zone of proximal development. The zone of proximal development is a range of skills a child can perform if guided, but can't accomplish alone. So what this means is that when a child is ready to learn the new thing, they are ready to learn something, then they are in the zone of proximal development. If the child, for example, for tying the shoes, before the child is able to manipulate things and having that fine motor skill and that dexterity to manipulate laces, they would not be able to learn how to tie their shoe. So they would not be in that zone of proximal development until they get to a point where maybe they're able to observe somebody tying shoes, they're able to manipulate those laces, and they can be guided. So if they're in the zone of proximal development and they're learning to tie their shoes, you could tell them, okay, make bunny ears, or there's several ways to do it, but make the bunny ears, cross over the bunny ears, tie the, pull them across, or, there's several cute little rhymes that can be made up for tying shoes, which I cannot think of right now, but so you can guide the child and you can tell the child, cross this one over, drop that one, pick that one up, pinch it together, pull. You can give them the guidance they need to accomplish the task, but they have to be ready. They have to be in that zone of proximal development. They have to have the physiological ability to do it, and they have to have the cognitive capacity ready to do it. There is something called scaffolding, where you build one skill on top of another skill on top of another skill. So back to the zone of proximal development, when we're tying shoes, the child can continually practice with your guidance until finally they can do it on their own. Scaffolding is when you start building things from scratch. So you're building a scaffolding for the child to tie their shoes. You're showing them first how to make the loops. You're showing them how to bring the string around. You're showing them these little steps. You're building a little scaffolding for them to be able to do it. So when they're ready to do it by themselves, they do something called private speech. Oftentimes they'll say, okay, I need to do this, and then I need to do this, and they will talk themselves through it, or they'll say the little rhyme that they've learned in order to do that task. So they use something called private speech, and scaffolding is where they build one skill on top of another skill on top of another skill until they finally accomplish the goal, which was tying the shoe. Guided participation is an extension of the theory. Whoops. So guided participation is basically where you're just, once again, you're guiding the child through the steps of doing something. All right, language development. Language development is a social functionality. Obviously, to communicate with each other is a very social skill. So we have to develop language in order to communicate with each other. As humans, we don't do as much with nonverbal communication, although we do our body language, our facial expressions. There are a lot of ways that we communicate nonverbally. However, our language is the primary way that we communicate with one another. It is a social skill. It is a social, we use it to function socially within our communities. It is an important and distinguishing feature of humans. Language is considered considered to have infinite generativity. In other words, it combines symbols in infinite ways. In other words, I could say, all that means is that there's an unlimited way in which I can say stuff. I could say a sentence that maybe has never been said before. I might be able to say, the pink elephant with purple ears tied a blue tie around his dog Snuffy. I don't know if anybody's ever said that sentence before, but I can say it because our language has infinite generativity. I can combine symbols, like if I was writing it out, it would be symbols, or words in an infinite manner. And that's what that means by infinite generativity. Language is something that is tricky business in some areas. There is no doubt that animals have elaborate communication systems. Crows have an incredible diversity of sounds that they make to communicate with each other. Elephants have a huge range of sounds that they make that we can't hear. They are too low for us to hear, too low of a frequency. We know that even just chickens will have a certain a way that they cluck to tell you that there's a hawk in the sky and you better hide under something. They have another way to cluck to say, hurry up, chicks, come here. They have another way to cluck to say, you need to run. They have a lot of different ways of communicating with each other. Some animals have used sign language. We have, as humans, taught some chimpanzees and other animals how to use sign language in a limited way. We have seen that sometimes these animals will create and use the language in a way different than they were taught, which shows that they have a deeper understanding of the language that we're trying to teach them. However, we are trying to teach them to speak the way we speak, and we communicate different than the way these animals do. So there is an argument going on as to whether or not some of these chimpanzees and other animals are actually utilizing what we would call language in a way similar to the way humans communicate. The argument is definitely, an argument that can be made is that the chimpanzee cannot use the language in an unlimited capacity and say a sentence like I just said. But we do know that a lot of these apes can come up with unique sentences that nobody has said to them and has not been taught to them. It's just that they are limited. Okay, that's a whole nother story we're not getting into right now. All right, humans have a biological predisposition to be able to speak. We know early on in human development that specialized structures have formed in order for us to make these vocalizations. We know that we have brain specialization. There's certain areas of our brain that are dedicated to our language use. There are specific genes that are involved in language. And according to Noam Chomsky, who is a researcher of cognitive development, he postulated that we are born with something called a language acquisition device, kind of an innate mechanical ability and an innate ability that is going to help us to identify and learn language. We know that to some degree this is true. It does appear that under most circumstances, people will learn language and they will learn to speak. We do know from some very, very sad cases where children have been abused and neglected, locked in closets, things like that for years, to where they were not exposed to language at any time, where nobody ever spoke to these children, that they had very limited capacity to develop language. They were able to develop a certain amount of language, but not very much. So we do know that there is a timing also involved in this, that there's some innate ability, but we also know that there's a big learning component as well. These are some specialized areas. The two that I want to talk about is Wernicke's area. It's Wernicke's actually, Wernicke's area, or Wernicke's area, and Broca's area. And these are two of our language processing areas of our brain. And in a later video, I will be showing you examples with somebody with Broca's aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia, where there is some differences. Broca's area, if somebody has damage to this particular area of their brain, they're going to have difficulty producing language. They can understand it, but they'll have different difficulty producing it. If this other area is injured, Wernicke's area, you would have trouble understanding and producing language. Or actually, you could produce language. You could produce language, but it would be nonsensical. You would say sentences that make no sense at all. So these are a couple of different brain areas, and we will talk more about those at a later time. 12 months to 18 months, there is a slow expansion during this first period of time of language development. It is slow and steady. There's wide variability as to when children learn to speak, but there are certain patterns that we see. Their first 50 words or so are usually part of a toddler's daily routine, like cup, you know, cookie, whatever it is. Words like that is their first 50. They start off with something called hollow phrases, which are basically little one word phrases, or very short phrases like cookie, my cookie. You have very short phrases. And then we have overextensions and underextensions of language that we see as well. An overextension would be kind of an overuse of grammar rules that we see, or where we might say, okay, an overextension is, I have a cat named Fluffy, so an overextension would be that every cat I see is now Fluffy. That's an overextension. An underextension would be an example of, I have a dog, every dog I see is going to be a dog. It is not going to be Fluffy. Okay, that one's rough. Anyway, I'm really tired. I'm sorry, guys. Okay, 18 months to 24 months, the naming explosion. Basically, during that first period of time, children are learning words at a much slower pace. They're learning words from their environment, cup, you know, dog, cat, different things that they're doing. Things that they see in their everyday environment are the things that they're talking about, the words that they're saying. Later on, at 24 months, there's something really amazing and fascinating that occurs. They do something called fast mapping. Fast mapping is when they start to really just start saying all kinds of words. They just have an explosion of language that happens, where they just start all of a sudden speaking a tremendous amount, and their vocabulary just seems to really take off. So, you know, whereas before they were using what's called a hollow phrase, which is just like a 1 or 2 word little sentence, now we're using telegraphic speech. So we are using much bigger phrases than we were previously. 24 months to 36 months, they get a lot better at language. They don't make as many errors with their language. They show an understanding of the basic rules of language. There are some little errors that they make that we'll probably talk about later, but they, well, I guess we'll talk about it right now. They show, so our grammar rules are interesting because kids seem to pick that up kind of automatically. And what we see is we see a lot of times kids saying things like, I run really fast, or we go to the store. Now, we know that their parents are probably not saying to them, we run really fast, or we go to the store. That's probably not something that they're hearing in their environment, but it is something that we see consistently with our English-speaking kids that are learning to speak. And this is called regularization, where they over-apply certain grammar rules to their language. And it's kind of fascinating because we see this in our culture very much, in Western society, that we see this over-regularization. Okay, learning language in a social and cultural context, research on language development. Humans are built for learning language. We already kind of talked about that. We do know that there's some sort of innate ability for us to speak. We also know that learning is very important, and exposure to language we know is very important. Some research suggests that there is differences in social class. And there have been research studies done that have compared lower socioeconomic class parents to higher socioeconomic class parents, and looking at how many words per day they speak to their children and how many words per day their children speak. And interestingly, and probably not surprisingly, we see that people with the higher socioeconomic status have children with higher amount of words being spoken. These parents are often spending more time with their kids, being able to read with them more and speak more with them, whereas somebody from a lower socioeconomic class may not have that luxury. They may not have the ability to sit down and read a couple of 2 or 3 books every night and do all sorts of enrichment with their child, because, you know, maybe they're a single mom or single dad just trying to make ends meet and trying to get stuff done. So it's a lot more of a struggle for somebody from a lower socioeconomic class. And we found that some of the research has shown that these parents speak less frequently to their children, or less words per day to their children, than the higher socioeconomic class status. So those social class differences make a difference in the initial amount of words or vocabulary that our kids start with. Maternal responsiveness is another thing that seems to make a difference in language development. Affirmation and expansions of language are correlated positively with early milestones. So a mom that is affirming when a child says something and maybe expanding on what they said, giving them more vocabulary, or, you know, guiding them with their vocabulary to grow that vocabulary, that tends to help them as well. And these things are correlated with having some of these milestones with language met earlier. All right, wow, that was a struggle. All right, thank you so much for being here and for tuning in to this video. I hope you find it useful. I am hoping that I can just continue to make these videos, and I hope that they are useful. Anyway, this one was a little bit bumpy, a little bit rough, but that's what we got, so that's what we're going with. I hope you guys have a good day. Stay safe, stay healthy. Until next time, take care.